There's a unique and profound loneliness that settles in on a long stretch of highway in the dead of night, a darkness that most of us will never experience. For the truckers who live their lives on the asphalt, this isolation is their constant companion. They navigate the forgotten roads and desolate landscapes where the normal rules of the world can begin to fray. But what happens when something truly terrifying breaks that silence? Here at Verified Fears, we've compiled the most chilling, authentic accounts from drivers who have stared into that darkness and seen something stare back. Before we journey into these 11 most disturbing true trucker horror stories, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to travel these roads alone. The rain wasn't just falling, it was clinging. Dale had been a long-haul trucker for 27 years, and he'd learned that there were a dozen different kinds of rain. There was the angry, percussive kind that hammered on the roof of his cab like a drum solo. There was the soft, misty kind that felt more like driving through a cloud than a storm. This, however, was the worst kind. It was a cold, persistent drizzle that smeared across his windshield, turning the world outside into a blurry watercolor of gray and black. It was the kind of rain that seeped into your bones and made the endless miles of Oregon's Highway 26 feel even more desolate than usual. He'd been pushing for 12 hours straight, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the monotonous drone of the tires on wet asphalt. The world had shrunk to the twin beams of his headlights, cutting a swath through the oppressive darkness and the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the wipers. It was a hypnotic, lonely existence, a bubble of warmth and light moving through an ocean of cold nothingness. He was thinking about a hot meal, a dry bed, and the familiar comfort of a truck stop when a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision broke the trance. There, standing on the narrow shoulder, was a figure. It was a young woman, barely more than a girl, with long, dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. She wore a simple, thin dress that looked utterly inadequate for the weather, and she held her arms wrapped around herself, though she wasn't shivering. She just stood there, a pale, static image in the swirling mist, her thumb half-heartedly extended. Every instinct Dale had honed over nearly 3 decades on the road screamed at him to keep going. You don't stop. Not at this hour, not in the middle of nowhere, and certainly not for a lone figure who seemed to have materialized out of the fog itself. The stories truckers told were full of cautionary tales, of traps, of robberies, of things far worse. Yet there was something about her that made him hesitate. It was the profound stillness of her posture, the way she seemed less like a person in distress and more like a part of the sorrowful landscape. He imagined his own daughter, who was about her age, stranded and alone in the cold. The thought was a sharp pang in his chest. Against his better judgment, he felt his foot ease off the accelerator. The air brakes hissed, a long, mournful sigh that cut through the night. He pulled the rig over about 50 yards past her and watched in his side mirror as she walked toward the passenger door, her steps strangely unhurried. She didn't run to escape the rain. She moved with a placid grace that was deeply unsettling. He leaned over and pushed the door open. "Get in," he grunted, trying to sound gruff and intimidating, a defense against his own foolishness. "Get out of this miserable weather." She slid onto the passenger seat without a word. A wave of cold air entered the cab with her, a damp, earthy smell like wet leaves and freshly turned soil. It was a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. It was a deep, penetrating cold that made the hairs on Dale's arms stand on end. He cranked the heater up, but the feeling didn't subside. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper above the hum of the engine. It was a clean, clear sound, like tiny bells. "Ain't no place for a young lady to be out here on a night like this," Dale said, putting the truck in gear and pulling back onto the highway. "Where you headed?" "Just up the road a ways," she replied, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windshield. "Number 14, Black Creek Lane." Dale frowned. He knew this route like the back of his hand. He'd driven it hundreds of times. "Can't say I've ever heard of a Black Creek Lane around here." "It's there," she said, her tone flat, offering no further explanation. He glanced over at her. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, her skin was almost translucent, her eyes dark and deep-set. She was pretty, in a fragile, old-fashioned sort of way. Her dress, now that he could see it better, looked like something from another era, simple and unadorned. There was no purse, no phone, no luggage of any kind. It was as if she had simply walked out of the woods and onto the road. "You run into some car trouble?" he asked, trying to fill the heavy silence that had settled between them. "You could say that," she whispered. "I was just trying to get home. It got so cold, so fast." An uncomfortable quiet fell over the cab again. Dale was a talker by nature. Silence on a long haul could drive a man mad. But he couldn't think of anything to say. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken melancholy. The unnatural chill seemed to be emanating directly from her. And the cab, once his safe, warm sanctuary, now felt like a cold, cramped tomb. He found himself gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white, his eyes darting between the road and his strange passenger. He noticed that not a single drop of water had dripped from her soaked hair or clothes onto the seat or the floor mat. She was drenched, yet she left no trace. They drove on for what felt like an eternity, the miles melting away into the fog. Dale kept his eyes peeled for a road sign, anything that might indicate Black Creek Lane. But there was nothing but the endless procession of towering pines lining the highway, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out from the darkness. "It's just ahead," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through his tense concentration. "You can let me out here." Dale looked around. They were in the deepest part of the forest, miles from the nearest town. There were no lights, no houses, not even a dirt track leading off the main road. "Here? There's nothing here." "This is the place," she insisted, her voice retaining its eerie calm. As he slowed the truck, a deer, its eyes wide and terrified in the sudden glare of the headlights, darted out from the trees. Dale cursed and stomped on the brakes. The rig groaned in protest, the tires screeching on the wet pavement as he swerved to avoid the animal. It was over in a second. The deer vanished back into the woods, and Dale's heart was pounding against his ribs. He took a deep breath to steady himself and turned to his passenger. "You all right?" he asked. The seat was empty. Dale stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. She was gone. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't heard anything over the screech of the brakes. He reached over a trembling hand and pushed on the passenger door. It was still locked from the inside, just as it had been since she'd gotten in. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He fumbled for the overhead light, flooding the cab with a harsh, sterile glow. The passenger seat was completely empty and dry, except for one small, damp patch right in the center, a cold spot that seemed to suck the warmth from his fingertips when he touched it. His breath hitched in his throat. Had he fallen asleep? Was this some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion? The highway hypnosis old-timers warned you about? But the cold in the cab was real. The memory of her soft, bell-like voice was real. He killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. He grabbed his heaviest flashlight, threw open his door, and jumped down onto the wet asphalt, his boots splashing in a puddle. "Hello?" he yelled, his voice sounding small and thin against the vast, silent forest. "Hey, where'd you go?" He swept the powerful beam of the flashlight across the road into the dense wall of trees. The light cut through the rain and fog, illuminating nothing but glistening leaves and dark, dripping branches. There were no footprints on the muddy shoulder, no sign that anyone had been there at all. There was only the sound of the wind, a low, mournful moan as it rustled through the tops of the pines. It sounded like it was whispering a name he couldn't quite make out. Shaking, he climbed back into the cab, the feeling of being watched prickling the back of his neck. He started the engine and drove, pushing the rig faster than he should have on the slick roads, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and that spot. He didn't stop until he saw the warm, welcoming lights of a 24-hour diner in the next town. He stumbled inside, the bell over the door jingling brightly, and sank onto a stool at the counter. A middle-aged waitress with a kind, tired face poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice warm. Dale let out a shaky laugh. "Maybe I have." On a desperate hunch, he asked, "Ma'am, this is going to sound crazy, but have you ever heard of a place called Black Creek Lane around here?" The waitress's friendly smile faltered. She set the coffee pot down slowly, her eyes clouding over. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's no lane by that name, not anymore. There's just the old Black Creek Cemetery, about 15 miles back." She leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "Local legend says a long time ago, maybe 60 or 70 years, a young woman named Eliza was walking home along that stretch of highway on a night just like this. A sudden storm hit, a freak blizzard. She froze to death before she could make it home. They say she still walks that road when the weather turns bad, trying to flag down a ride, forever trying to finish her journey." The coffee cup trembled in Dale's hand. The blood drained from his face. The name. The cold. It all clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. He paid for the coffee he hadn't touched and walked back to his truck on unsteady legs. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring into the darkness. The cab didn't feel like his own anymore. It felt violated, haunted by the memory of his silent passenger. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, he started the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the lonely highway, the wind picked up, swirling around the cab. And carried on that wind, as clear and close as if she were sitting right beside him, he heard a soft, ethereal whisper. "Thank you for the ride. Let's move to our second story." Frank's body ached with a familiar, dull throb that had become the soundtrack to his life on the road. It was the ache of too many hours spent in the same position, of cheap coffee and greasy diner food, of sleep caught in 2-hour increments. He was somewhere deep in the flat, featureless plains of Nebraska, where the sky was a vast, starless void, and the land was just a darker shade of black. The sign for the rest stop had appeared like a ghost out of the gloom, promising a few minutes of respite from the monotonous grind. He pulled his 18-wheeler into the designated truck parking, the massive vehicle sighing as it settled. The lot was nearly empty. There was one other rig parked at the far end, its cab dark and silent, and a beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates near the squat, concrete bathroom building. The place was bathed in the sickly orange glow of a few buzzing sodium lamps that did more to create shadows than to dispel the darkness. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was immense, broken only by the distant hum of the highway and the ticking of his cooling engine. For a moment, he just sat there, letting the exhaustion wash over him. Rule number 1 of the road: never push when you're tired. It's how mistakes happen. This was just a routine stop. Stretch the legs, check the tires, maybe grab the thermos from behind the seat. He'd done it 1,000 times before. As he swung the heavy door open and his boots hit the cracked asphalt, his gaze swept the area out of habit. You always check your surroundings. He scanned the empty picnic tables, the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the property, the other silent vehicles, and that's when he saw it. At the very edge of the light, cast by his own truck, standing near the tree line, was a shape. It wasn't distinct, more like a patch of darkness that was somehow darker than the surrounding night. It was tall and unnaturally thin, a vertical slash of black against the gray. Frank squinted, his road-weary eyes trying to make sense of it. A tree trunk? A weirdly shaped sign he'd never noticed before? It was probably nothing. Just a trick of the light, his tired mind playing games. He shook his head, dismissing it, and began his walk around. He kicked each of the 18 tires with the steel toe of his boot, the familiar, solid thud, a comforting ritual. He checked the seals on his trailer, ran a hand along the cool metal, his mind already drifting to the delivery schedule, the logbook, the miles still ahead. But a strange, prickling sensation crawled up the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched. It was a primal instinct he'd learned to trust over the years. He stopped his inspection and slowly looked back toward the tree line. The shadow was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. Yet, Frank felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It seemed clearer now, more defined. He could almost make out the suggestion of a head and shoulders, a slender, elongated form that was distinctly man-like, but wrong in its proportions. Just a tree, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding loud in the quiet lot. He was tired. That's all it was. He'd seen stranger things in the dead of night. Still, he found himself walking a little faster, his routine feeling less like a ritual and more like a nervous habit. He finished his check and climbed back into the relative safety of his cab, the door shutting with a solid, reassuring thud. He locked it. He never locked the door at a rest stop. He reached for his thermos of coffee, but his hand paused. His eyes were glued to the passenger side mirror. From this new angle, he could still see the spot where the shadow had been. It was there, and it was closer. It was no longer at the tree line. It was standing in the open now, halfway between the woods and his truck. It was still just a silhouette, a void in the shape of a man. But there was no mistaking it. It had moved. It had moved while his back was turned. Frank's heart began to hammer against his ribs. This wasn't right. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone from the other truck, stretching their legs. But why would they just stand there, in the dark, perfectly still? And why did they look like that? There was no substance to the figure, no reflection of the orange lamps on clothing or skin. It was pure, absolute black. He felt a surge of anger, an emotion that was easier to handle than the cold dread seeping into his bones. Was someone trying to mess with him? Some local kids looking for a thrill? "All right, you son of a bitch," he whispered, his hand reaching for the switch for his high beams. He flicked it on, Two powerful beams of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the empty patch of grass with brutal clarity. There was nothing there. Not a person, not a tree, not a sign. Just overgrown weeds and a discarded fast food bag that danced in the sudden light. Frank stared, his breath held tight in his chest. He had seen it. He knew he had. He flicked the high beams off. The moment the world plunged back into the dim orange glow, it was back. And it was closer still. A choked gasp escaped his lips. It was now at the edge of the parking lot, standing on the asphalt, not 20 yards from his passenger door. It was as if the light had no effect on it, as if it existed in a different layer of reality, visible only in the shadows. He could see its form more clearly now. Impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, with limbs that were too long, too thin. It had no discernible features, just a flat, light-absorbing silhouette. The paranoia hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't tired. He was losing his mind. This is what it felt like. The years of solitude, the endless miles. They had finally broken something inside him. He squeezed his eyes shut, rubbing them hard with the heels of his hands until he saw spots. He was hallucinating. He had to be. He took a slow, deep breath and opened his eyes, forcing himself to look away, to focus on the interior of his cab. The familiar worn dashboard, the photo of his wife and kids taped to the sun visor, the faint smell of stale coffee and diesel. This was real. He dared a glance back at the mirror. It was still there. It had taken another step and another. It wasn't walking. It was just appearing closer each time he looked. A slow, silent, horrifying advance. Frank's hands trembled as he fumbled for the ignition key. The engine roared to life, a violent, desperate sound in the suffocating silence. He wasn't going to stay here. He wasn't going to sit and watch this thing, whatever it was, get any closer. His plan was simple. Get the truck in gear, get back on the highway, and drive until the sun came up. He slammed the truck into first gear, the transmission grinding in protest. He had to look one more time. He didn't want to. Every fiber of his being screamed at him not to. But he couldn't help it. He turned his head, not to the mirror, but to the passenger side window. His blood ran cold. It was there, standing right beside his truck. Its head was level with the top of the window, a featureless black oval that seemed to drink the light from the cab. He could have reached out and touched it. There was no face, no eyes, but he felt a gaze and an intense, malevolent pressure that pushed in on him, suffocating him. He was looking at something that did not belong in the world, a tear in the fabric of the night. He didn't scream. The sound was trapped in his throat, a tight, painful knot of pure terror. He didn't think. He reacted. He wrenched the steering wheel to the left and stomped on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing as he pulled out of the parking space with a reckless speed that defied the vehicle's size. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He roared out of the rest stop and onto the on-ramp, merging into the highway at a dangerously high speed, the blare of a passing car's horn a distant, meaningless sound. He drove for hours, his foot pressed to the floor, his eyes wide and unblinking. The sun eventually began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink. But it brought no comfort. The darkness of the rest stop had followed him. It was inside him now. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like a tall, thin figure. Every flicker of light in his rearview mirror made his heart leap into his throat. Frank never stopped at a rest stop at night again. He'd drive until he was on the verge of collapse, pulling over only at brightly lit, bustling truck stops packed with other drivers. But even then, in the noise and the light, he never felt safe. He knew that what he saw was real, and he knew that it was still out there, in the lonely, forgotten places of the night, standing perfectly still, just waiting. A shadow that, once seen, could never be unseen. Let's move to our third story. The CB radio was more than just a piece of equipment for Kevin. It was a companion. For a man who spent 20 days a month traversing the loneliest highways in America, the crackle and hiss of the radio was a comforting presence. It was a lifeline, a smoke signal in the vast, empty wilderness of the open road. It was the sound of other people, other lives, a constant reminder that he wasn't entirely alone out there. But on this particular night, cutting through the heart of the Nevada desert on U.S. Route 50, dubbed the loneliest road in America, that comfort was about to curdle into a unique and terrifying form of dread. The night was absolute. The moon was a sliver, offering no real light, and the stars were a cold, distant spray against a canvas of pure black. The desert stretched out on all sides, a silent, sleeping beast under the night sky. Kevin's headlights were the only things that existed in this world, carving a tunnel of reality through an endless void. He'd been on the road for 10 hours, and the hypnotic rhythm of the drive had settled deep into his bones. He took a sip of stale, lukewarm coffee and reached over to adjust the squelch on his CB, hoping to catch a stray bit of chatter. Usually, this deep in the basin, there was nothing. You were in a dead zone, too far from any town or major route to pick up a signal. Tonight was no different. The speaker emitted a steady, soft hiss of static, the sound of an empty universe. It was a lonely sound, but a familiar one. He left it on, the white noise a preferable alternative to the deafening silence of the cab. He drove for another hour, the only change in the landscape being the occasional ghostly shape of a yucca plant flashing in his high beams. Then, a crackle. It was sharp and loud, making him jump in his seat. It wasn't the usual pop of interference. It was followed by a sound like a long, slow exhale, a breathy whisper that seemed to curl out of the speaker and hang in the air. Where the road gets thin. The voice was distorted, a low, gravelly whisper buried under layers of static, as if it were being broadcast from the bottom of a well. Kevin frowned, fiddling with the dial. It was probably just a skip, a freak atmospheric event bouncing a signal from hundreds of miles away. Still, it was unnerving. The words were so clear, yet so strange. He was about to dismiss it when it came again, a little clearer this time. No water, just salt and bone. A chill traced its way down Kevin's spine. This wasn't trucker talk. There was no 10-4 or good buddy. It was poetic, almost biblical, and deeply unsettling. He grabbed the mic. Anyone on this channel? You're coming in broken? He said, his own voice sounding foreign and loud. The only reply was the soft hiss of static. He waited, his hand hovering over the mic. Nothing. He shook his head. His mind was playing tricks on him. Sleep deprivation was a hell of a drug. He took another swig of coffee and tried to focus on the road. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled to life again. This time, it was a different voice, higher pitched, almost like a child's, but with the same distorted, watery quality. The rabbit is in the box. The rabbit is in the box. It repeated the phrase 3 times, each repetition sounding more frantic than the last. The rabbit is in the box? Kevin whispered to himself. He was hauling a sealed container of machine parts from Sacramento to Salt Lake City. There was no rabbit. It was nonsense. But the sheer panic in the disembodied voice made his skin crawl. "This is KW542, northbound on 50, he said into the mic, his voice tight. "Who's on this channel? What's your 20? The childlike voice stopped abruptly. It was replaced by the first voice, the low, gravelly whisper. "We see you, KW542. We see the Sandman." Kevin's blood turned to ice. KW542 was his call sign, one he hadn't used in years. And the Sandman. That was his handle, his road name. Only old-timers and his closest friends on the road knew that name. No one used handles anymore, not really. How could anyone out here in the middle of this dead zone know his name? Panic began to bubble in his chest. He reached to turn the CB off, his fingers fumbling for the volume knob. Before he could touch it, a third voice came through. It was a woman's voice, calm and melodic, but it had the same ethereal, distant quality as the others. "He's reaching for the dial. He doesn't like our song." Kevin snatched his hand back, as if the radio were red hot. They knew what he was doing. They were watching him. He frantically scanned the darkness outside, the empty desert, the road behind him in his mirrors. There was nothing. No headlights, no other trucks, just the infinite, oppressive blackness. He was completely alone. "Who is this?" he yelled into the cab, not even bothering with the mic. "What do you want?" the gravelly voice answered, a dry chuckle crackling through the speaker. "We want to talk. It's been so long. So lonely out here. Tell us about the coffee, Kevin. Is it cold yet?" He looked down at the cup in his hand. His name. They knew his name. A wave of nausea washed over him. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a signal skip. This was something else. Something impossible and malevolent. The cab of his truck, once his fortress of solitude, now felt like a cage, and these voices were in it, with him. "Tell us about your daughter," the woman's voice cooed. "Does she still like to draw pictures of horses?" A strangled sob escaped Kevin's throat. His daughter, Sarah, was 7. Her room was covered in her crayon drawings of horses. How could they know that? He had never spoken of her on the radio. He kept his road life and his home life completely separate. He slammed his fist on the dashboard. "Leave me alone." The child's voice began to giggle, a horrible, distorted sound that seemed to twist and echo inside the small space. "He's scared. The Sandman is scared of the dark." He grabbed the entire CB unit, yanking it with all his strength. Wires sparked and tore, but the voices didn't stop. They continued to pour from the dangling speaker, no longer connected to the main console. It was impossible. The unit had no power, yet it was alive. "You can't shut us out," the chorus of voices seemed to say in unison, their words overlapping into a cacophony of whispers. "We're in the air. We are the airwaves. We were here long before your roads cut through our quiet." Kevin was hyperventilating, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was losing his grip on reality. The road ahead began to blur through the tears of terror welling in his eyes. The voices swirled around him, whispering his name, his wife's name, the name of the street he grew up on. They recounted memories from his childhood, secrets he had never told a soul. They were peeling back the layers of his life, his very identity, broadcasting them into the empty desert night. He felt like his mind was being dissected by these unseen, all-knowing entities. They weren't just watching him. They were inside his head. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. One moment, The cab was filled with the torment of the whispering voices. The next, there was only the hum of the engine and the rumble of the tires. The dangling speaker was silent. The oppressive, watchful feeling had vanished, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Kevin looked up. Ahead of him, the first faint glow of dawn was touching the horizon, a thin line of purple and orange that pushed back against the suffocating darkness. At the same time, he saw the distant, twinkling lights of a town. He had crossed some invisible threshold. He was out of their territory. He didn't slow down. He drove straight through the town, not stopping until he reached a brightly lit, 24-hour truck stop on the other side. He pulled into the lot, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the key in the ignition. He sat there for a long time, bathed in the artificial daylight of the parking lot, the sun now rising fully behind him. He never used a CB radio again. He ripped the entire system out of his truck and threw it in a dumpster in Salt Lake City. But he could never get rid of the voices. They lived in his memory, a chilling reminder of his journey through the loneliest road in America. He learned that night that some places are empty for a reason. They are quiet because something ancient is listening, waiting for a stray signal to lock onto, waiting for a lonely traveler to whisper its terrible secrets to. Let's move to our fourth story. Mark was a creature of habit and logic. In his 15 years behind the wheel, he'd learned that the world operated on a simple, reliable set of principles. Diesel engines required maintenance, logbooks required honesty, and highways, no matter how long, always had a beginning and an end. He was a map man, a navigator who found comfort in the predictable geometry of the interstate system. He was hauling a load of produce from Des Moines to Denver, a route he'd driven so many times he could mark his progress by the specific pattern of cracks in the asphalt. Tonight, he was deep in the plains of central Nebraska, a stretch of I-80 so flat and straight you could tape the steering wheel down and take a nap if you were a bigger fool than he was. The fog appeared without warning. It wasn't the gentle, creeping mist that sometimes rose from the fields at dusk. This was a sudden, thick, and unnaturally silent blanket that descended upon the highway, swallowing the world whole. One moment, Mark could see the distant glimmer of starlight. The next, his reality had shrunk to the 20-foot bubble illuminated by his headlights. The fog was a solid, pearlescent wall that muffled all sound, even the familiar roar of his own engine, reducing it to a low, anxious hum. He slowed his speed, his hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, his eyes straining to see the white lines on the road. It was like driving through milk. Up ahead, a familiar sign emerged from the gloom, its green and white letters glowing softly. The Prairie Dog Diner. World's best coffee, next exit. Mark smiled faintly. He knew the place. It was a classic old-school truck stop with a giant, kitschy statue of a prairie dog wearing a cowboy hat out front. He'd stopped there a few times over the years. Seeing it was a good landmark. It meant he was making good time. He passed the exit, the diner's warm lights a faint, blurry smear to his right, and pushed on into the soupy fog. He drove for what he judged to be a solid hour, his eyes locked on the road, his world a monotonous cycle of white lines appearing and disappearing. The fog showed no signs of letting up. He should have been well past the diner, approaching the turnoff for Highway 30. He was starting to feel the first twinges of an unsettling disorientation when another green and white sign materialized out of the mist. The Prairie Dog Diner, world's best coffee, next exit. Mark blinked, his brow furrowing. That was impossible. He couldn't have gotten turned around. The road was a straight line. He must have misjudged the time, maybe dozed for a second. Or perhaps there were two diners with the same name and a similar sign. It was a stretch, but it was a more palatable explanation than the alternative. He shook his head, blaming the hypnotic effect of the fog, and kept driving, a little more alert this time, a little less certain. He turned on the radio, hoping for a weather report or just a human voice to break the oppressive silence. Nothing. He cycled through the AM and FM bands, but the speaker emitted only a dead, empty hiss. He pulled out his phone. No service. Of course. He checked his GPS. The screen showed the flat gray grid of the map, but the little blue arrow that represented his truck was gone. In its place was a single, pulsing blue dot in a sea of gray, with no roads, no towns, nothing. It was as if he had driven off the edge of the world. A cold, heavy feeling began to settle in the pit of his stomach. The cab, his rolling office and home, suddenly felt small and confining, a fragile shell against the vast, unknowable emptiness outside. He focused on driving, on the simple mechanics of keeping the truck on the road. He drove for another hour, then 2. The sun should have been thinking about rising by now, but the sky remained a uniform, lightless gray, indistinguishable from the fog-choked land. His fuel gauge hadn't moved. It was still pointing to just over half a tank, exactly where it had been 3 hours ago. And then he saw it. The sign. The Prairie Dog Diner. This time, the sight of it sent a jolt of pure, undiluted fear through him. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. He was trapped. He was driving in a loop. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. As he passed the exit, he stared at the diner. The giant prairie dog statue seemed to be looking right at him. Its painted-on smile now a mocking, sinister grin. Panic began to set in. A frantic, clawing thing in his chest. He had to do something. He couldn't just keep driving in circles. He pulled the truck to a screeching halt in the middle of the empty interstate. He had to think. He would turn around. He would drive in the opposite direction until he broke out of this, whatever this was. The process of turning the massive rig around on the narrow highway was a nerve-wracking 15-point turn. The trailer's warning beeper, a shrill, lonely cry in the dead silence. Finally facing the other way, he hit the accelerator, a renewed sense of purpose steadying his hands. He drove with a desperate intensity, his eyes scanning for anything different, any break in the pattern. But there was only the fog, the endless white lines, and the suffocating silence. After an hour of driving west on Interstate 80, he saw a sign emerge from the fog. The Prairie Dog Diner. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat. It was impossible. He was going the other way. The diner should have been behind him. He was losing his mind. The isolation, the fog, the endless road. It had finally snapped his sanity. He started to see things in the swirling mist at the edge of his headlights. Tall, slender shapes that seemed to move in, step with his truck, figures that would vanish the moment he tried to focus on them. He didn't know how long he drove. Time had lost all meaning. It was just a continuous, unending present of fear and confusion. He was a ghost in a ghost machine, haunting a stretch of highway that existed outside of time. He passed the diner again and again. Each time, it seemed a little more decayed, a little more menacing. The lights in the windows flickered and died. The prairie dog statue was covered in what looked like moss and vines, its cheerful face peeling away to reveal a dark, rotting wood beneath. He was broken. He slumped over the wheel, tears of pure despair and terror streaming down his face. He didn't care anymore. He just kept his foot on the pedal, his mind a numb, buzzing void. He was part of the road now, another one of its ghosts. As the Prairie Dog Diner sign appeared for the 10th, or maybe the 100th time, he noticed something had changed. The letters were different. They were twisted, rearranged. It no longer said, "World's Best Coffee." It said, "The world ends here." Something inside him snapped. It was a final, primal instinct for survival. With a roar of defiance, he swerved the truck, aiming it directly at the exit ramp. He wasn't going to pass it again. He was going to the diner. He didn't know what he would find, but it had to be better than this endless purgatory. He thundered down the ramp, his truck groaning in protest. The moment his tires left the interstate and hit the exit ramp, the fog vanished. It didn't thin or dissipate. It evaporated in an instant. He was bathed in the brilliant, blinding light of the midday sun. He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt. He looked around, his heart pounding. He was on the side of Interstate 80, on the shoulder of the westbound lane. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was warm. He looked at his dashboard clock. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. He had lost nearly 12 hours. He looked back toward the exit. There was no diner. There was no statue. There was nothing but an old, dilapidated billboard, its message faded by years of sun. All he could make out was a single word: welcome. He looked at his fuel gauge. It was almost on empty. Mark sat there for a long time, the familiar world feeling alien and fragile. He was free. But a part of him was still back there, in the fog, on that impossible stretch of road. He had driven on a highway that never ended, a place where the rules of the world didn't apply. And he knew, with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his days, that the road would be waiting for him if he ever passed that way again. Let's move to our 5th story. Sal was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a 40-year veteran of the road, a stout, practical man with a network of wrinkles around his eyes that spoke of countless sunrises and a million miles of asphalt. He'd heard every ghost story, every urban legend the truck stops had to offer, and he dismissed them all with a cynical grunt. The real monsters, he always said, were black ice, blown tires, and the fool in the RV who didn't understand how long it took 18 wheels to come to a stop. His world was one of mechanics, logistics, and tangible dangers. But as dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the rolling hills of West Virginia in shades of bruised purple and orange, Sal was about to encounter a threat that was terrifyingly real, yet maddeningly inexplicable. He was navigating the winding 2-lane blacktop of Route 33, a road that coiled through the ancient dark woods of the Appalachians like a serpent. It was a lonely stretch, far from the bright, sterile uniformity of the interstate. Here, the trees crowded the road, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense canopy that deepened the twilight prematurely. It was the kind of road where you could drive for an hour and not see another soul. Which is why he noticed the car immediately. It appeared in his rearview mirror as he came out of a sharp turn, a pair of headlights that seemed to materialize out of the gloom. He didn't think much of it at first. It was probably a local, impatient to get around his slow-climbing rig. He kept a steady pace, expecting the car to whip out and pass him on the next straightaway. But it didn't. It just stayed there, a constant presence in his mirror, maintaining a distance of about 50 feet. After 10 minutes, Sal started to get annoyed. The driver was tailgating him, their headlights a persistent, irritating glare. "All right, buddy, come on," he muttered, tapping his brakes lightly, a universal signal to back off. The car's headlights dipped for a moment as it slowed, but then it crept right back up to its previous position, a leech on his bumper. Sal sighed, a mix of frustration and resignation. He found a short, straight stretch of road and slowed down, hugging the shoulder to give the car plenty of room to pass. It was a clear invitation. The car pulled into the oncoming lane, and Sal prepared for the roar of its engine as it sped by. Instead, it just stayed there, driving parallel to his cab for a few seconds before tucking back in behind him. A prickle of unease ran down Sal's neck. That was strange. Not just impatient, but weird. He glanced at his rearview mirror again, trying to get a look at the driver. The car was a junker, an older model sedan, maybe a Ford Taurus or something similar, its color lost in the deepening twilight. The windshield was grimy, and the driver was just a vague silhouette. Sal squinted, trying to make out a face, a hat, anything. And then he saw them. The eyes. Through the dirt and the glare, he could see a pair of eyes staring directly at him. They were wide, unblinking, and seemed to catch the light from his own dashboard in a way that was unnatural. He couldn't see the rest of the face. Not the nose, not the mouth. Just the intense, unwavering stare. It was a look of such focused, predatory stillness that Sal felt a jolt, as if a circuit had been completed between them. He quickly looked away, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. He told himself he was imagining things. It was the light playing tricks, his mind filling in the blanks. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The car behind him was no longer just a vehicle. It was an entity, and its eyes were boring into the back of his head. For the next half hour, they continued this silent, unnerving dance. Sal would speed up, and the car would speed up, its headlights clinging to him like iron filings to a magnet. He would slow down, and the car would slow down, never passing, never falling back. It was a perfect, terrifying mimicry. The road was getting darker, the woods on either side a solid wall of black. The feeling of isolation, usually a comfort to Sal, was now a source of mounting dread. There was no one else out here, no witnesses, no help. His practical mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Was it a cop in an unmarked car, waiting for him to make a mistake? No, a cop would have pulled him over by now. Was it road rage? He hadn't cut anyone off or done anything to provoke another driver. It had to be a prank, some local kids with a twisted sense of fun. But the intensity of that stare, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a hunt. He decided to force the issue. A small gravel turnoff for a scenic overlook was coming up on the right. It was a long shot, but maybe he could lose them. At the last possible second, he hit his turn signal and wrenched the wheel, pulling the massive rig into a sharp, lurching turn onto the gravel road. The truck protested, the trailer groaning as it was forced off the smooth asphalt. He killed his headlights and cut the engine, plunging the overlook into near total darkness. He sat in the sudden, ringing silence, his breath held tight in his chest, and listened. He heard the sedan slow down on the main road. He saw its headlights sweep past the entrance to the overlook and continue down the highway. A wave of relief washed over Sal, so powerful it made him feel dizzy. It worked. They were gone. He had been overreacting, letting the lonely road get to him. He let out a shaky breath and was about to restart the engine when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The crunch of tires on gravel. The sedan hadn't driven on. It had stopped just past the entrance, killed its own lights, and was now slowly, quietly, rolling into the overlook after him. The relief was replaced by a surge of pure, cold terror. This was not a game. This was deliberate. He saw the car's dark shape slide to a stop, about 100 feet away, blocking the only exit. He was trapped. He fumbled for his phone, his thick fingers clumsy with adrenaline. No service. The words mocked him from the screen. He was alone with them. He flicked on his high beams, flooding the small lot with brilliant, blinding light. The sedan was just sitting there, its engine a low, menacing idle. He still couldn't see the driver through the grimy windshield, but he didn't need to. He could feel those eyes on him, a palpable, malevolent pressure. He laid on his air horn, the deafening blast echoing through the silent mountains. It was a desperate, primal roar for help, a challenge to the thing in the car. The sedan's only response was to rev its engine, a guttural snarl that answered his horn. Then it started to move. It drove forward slowly, inexorably, until its bumper was just inches from his. Then it stopped. They sat there for a long, agonizing minute, two beasts facing off in the dark. Sal's mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. What did they want? Were they going to try and get into his cab? He grabbed the tire iron he kept wedged beside his seat, his knuckles white. Suddenly, the sedan's headlights flashed once, twice, and then it reversed, backing away slowly. But it didn't leave. It pulled to the side, and its lights went out, leaving it an almost invisible shape in the darkness. Waiting, watching. Sal knew he couldn't stay here. He was a sitting duck. His only advantage was the size and power of his rig. He had to get back on the road. He took a deep breath, slammed the truck into gear, and hit the accelerator, aiming for the exit. He expected the car to try and block him, to ram him. It did nothing. It just sat there, letting him go. As he pulled back onto the highway, his heart pounding, he thought it might be over. But as he looked in his mirror, the sedan's headlights flicked back on, and it pulled out of the overlook, falling into its familiar, menacing position right behind him. The game wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more terrifying phase. They hadn't trapped him in the overlook to attack him. They had trapped him to show him that they could. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Sal was done being the prey. He drove for another mile, his eyes darting between the road and the mirror. He saw his chance up ahead, a narrow, single-lane bridge over a deep ravine. It was an old, iron truss bridge, barely wide enough for his truck. As he approached the bridge, he slowed down dramatically. The sedan, caught by surprise, was forced to slow down as well. Just as his cab entered the bridge, Sal slammed on the brakes. The massive truck shuddered to a halt, completely blocking the entrance. The sedan, with no time to stop, plowed into the back of his trailer with a sickening crunch of metal. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Sal heard the sedan's engine roar as it tried to reverse. He put his own truck in reverse and pushed back, pinning the Ify smaller car against the guardrail of the bridge. Metal shrieked and groaned. He felt a series of frantic, desperate bumps against his trailer as the driver tried to break free. Then, with a final, loud crack, everything went still. Sal waited, his breath ragged, his body trembling. He slowly put the truck in drive and pulled forward, off the bridge. In his rearview mirror, he could see the sedan. It was crumpled against the bridge entrance, steam pouring from its mangled hood. One of its headlights was smashed, the other flickering like a dying eye. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. He didn't wait to see who got out. He floored it, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the wreck. He didn't stop for 50 miles. not until he pulled into the bright, crowded lot of a massive travel center. He stumbled out of his cab on shaky legs and went to inspect the back of his trailer. The rear bumper was dented, but otherwise, the truck was fine. As he ran his hand over the damage, his fingers brushed against something stuck in the twisted metal. It was a small piece of paper, folded and wedged into a crack. His heart hammering, he pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. It depicted a big truck on a road, and behind it, a small, crudely drawn car. In the windshield of the car, 2 large black circles were scribbled in for eyes. Underneath the drawing, in messy block letters, was a single, chilling word. Soon. Let's move to our 6th story. The job offer had come not through a dispatcher or a corporate load board, but through a hushed phone call from a guy who knew a guy. Ray's rig was on the verge of repossession, and the medical bills for his wife were stacked on his kitchen table like a monument to his own failure. He needed a miracle. The man on the phone didn't offer a miracle. He offered a solution wrapped in a thick wad of cash. The job was simple. Pick up a sealed container in a forgotten warehouse district in Gary, Indiana, and drive it nonstop to a dusty, unmarked airstrip in the middle of the Arizona desert. There were only 2 rules. No questions asked, and under no circumstances was he to break the seal on the container. The 2 men who met him at the warehouse were the kind of men who didn't smile. They were built like refrigerators, with flat, emotionless eyes that seemed to absorb the light. They paid him half up front, the crisp $100 bills feeling heavy and dirty in his hand. They watched as the container, a standard 20-foot steel box, was loaded onto his flatbed. It was rust-streaked and nondescript, but the door was sealed in a way Ray had never seen before. It wasn't just padlocked. It was secured with a series of thick, industrial-looking bolts and a heavy iron bar that had been welded into place. The manifest says machine parts. One of the men grunted, handing him a clipboard. That's all you need to know. His tone made it clear that this was not a suggestion, but a command. Ray just nodded, his mouth dry. He knew he was stepping over a line, hauling a ghost load for shadowy people. But the weight of the cash in his pocket was a powerful anesthetic for his conscience. He signed the papers, pulled his rig out of the crumbling warehouse, and pointed it west, telling himself it was just another job, just another box. For the first day, it was exactly that. He drove through Illinois and into Missouri, the miles rolling by under a gray, indifferent sky. The container was just dead weight behind him, silent and still. He ate on the move, drank bitter coffee from his thermos, and pushed the thoughts of what he was doing to the back of his mind. The money was the only thing that mattered. The first sound came as he was crossing into Oklahoma, late on the second night. It was a faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. So soft he initially dismissed it as a loose piece of equipment or a tire anomaly. But it was consistent, a steady, deliberate beat that seemed to sync up with the thrum of his own anxious heart. He turned the radio down, listening intently. There it was again. It sounded like something was shifting inside the container, something heavy. He checked his mirrors. The container was secure, the chains taut. It was probably just the load settling. He turned the radio back up, a little louder this time. But the seed of unease had been planted. Every time he hit a bump or took a turn, he found himself listening, waiting for the sound. As the hours stretched on, the sound began to change. The thumping was replaced by a scratching noise. It was a high-pitched, insistent sound, like nails dragging slowly across a metal surface. Scree, scrape. It was a sound that set his teeth on edge, a sound that conjured images of trapped animals, of desperation. Ray tried to rationalize it. The machine parts must have sharp edges. They were just scraping against the inside of the box as the truck moved. It was a perfectly logical explanation. But it didn't feel logical. The sound had a quality to it, a frantic energy that felt disturbingly organic. He pulled into a dark, empty rest stop somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, the silence of the planes rushing in as he killed the engine. He needed to check. He had to. He grabbed his flashlight and walked to the back of his trailer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stood before the sealed container, the beam of his light playing over the welded bar and the heavy bolts. The night was dead silent. No scratching, no thumping, nothing. He pressed his ear against the cold steel of the container door. He held his breath, listening. For a full minute, there was only the sound of his own blood roaring in his ears. He was about to pull away, to call himself a fool when he heard it. It was a whimper. It was so faint, so muffled by the thick steel, that he wasn't sure he'd heard it at all. But it was there. A low, mournful, whimpering sound. The sound of a dog, maybe. Or a child. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over him. What was in this box? The men's faces flashed in his mind, their cold, dead eyes. The cash in his pocket suddenly felt like a stone, dragging him down. He banged his fist on the door. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" He yelled, his voice cracking. The whimpering stopped. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the sound had been. Whatever was in there, it had heard him. It was listening. He stumbled back to his cab, his mind a chaotic storm. This wasn't machine parts. This was something alive. A person? Were they smuggling someone? Or was it something worse? He thought about the money. He thought about his wife. He thought about the men in the warehouse and the unspoken threat that hung around them. He started the truck and pulled back onto the highway, his foot heavy on the accelerator, as if he could outrun the truth of what he was hauling. But he couldn't outrun the sounds. They started again, louder this time, more desperate. The scratching was frantic now, a constant, frenzied scraping that seemed to come from all sides of the container at once. And the whimpering had changed. It sounded less like an animal and more like a human child, crying softly, calling out a word that sounded like "Mama." Ray felt his resolve begin to crumble. Every mile he drove was another mile of complicity. He was a part of this, a part of whatever horror was locked in that box. The moral weight was becoming unbearable. What if a child died in there because he was too scared, too greedy to do anything? That was a stain he knew he could never wash off his soul. By the time he reached the desolate landscapes of New Mexico, he was at his breaking point. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert. The crying from the container had become a constant, heartbreaking lament. He couldn't take it anymore. To hell with the money. To hell with the men. He pulled the truck over on a long, empty stretch of road, miles from anywhere. He got out, his face set with a grim determination. He grabbed the heavy-duty bolt cutters and a long steel crowbar from his toolbox. He was opening the box. He started with the bolts. They were thick and rusted, and it took all his strength to snap them, the sound of the metal groaning and then giving way with a loud crack that echoed in the desert silence. As he worked, the sounds from inside the container stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving. It was as if the occupant knew what he was doing and was waiting, holding its breath. The only thing left was the welded bar. He wedged the tip of the crowbar under it and threw his entire body weight against it. The metal groaned. He pushed again, a raw cry of exertion tearing from his throat. With a screech of tortured steel, the weld broke. The bar clattered to the ground. The door was unsealed. He stood there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling. He took one last deep breath and pulled. The heavy steel door swung open with a low, mournful groan. Ray aimed his flashlight into the dark interior, his body braced for whatever he might find. The container was empty, completely, utterly empty. There were no machine parts, no person, no animal. Just a bare steel floor and 4 bare walls. He swept the beam of the flashlight around the interior, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Where had the sounds come from? Had he gone insane? Then the beam of his flashlight caught something on the inside of the door he had just opened. He stepped closer, his blood running cold. The entire inner surface of the door was covered in deep, frantic scratch marks, gouged into the thick steel as if by something with claws of iron. They were not the marks of a human. They were the marks of a caged and furious beast. And at the very center of the door, scratched in letters a foot high, was a single, terrifying word. "Thank you." Ray stumbled backward, falling onto the dusty shoulder of the road, his mind reeling. The sounds, the crying. It had all been a trick, a lure. It wasn't a prisoner needing to be saved. It was a predator needing to be released. He hadn't been hauling cargo. He had been a key, driving a locked cage across the country. And he had just turned it. He scrambled back to his cab, not even bothering to close the container door. He drove away, not looking back. The now empty, gaping box on his trailer, a testament to his horrifying mistake. He never went to the airstrip. He drove until his rig ran out of fuel, then he left it on the side of the road, the keys in the ignition, and just walked away. He took the blood money, but it brought him no peace. Because now, every time the wind howls through the lonely places of the world, Ray can't help but listen. He listens for a faint scratching sound, for a child's whimper on the breeze. He knows what he let out of that box, and he knows that it's out there, somewhere in the darkness, and it's free. Let's move to our 7th story. There's a point of exhaustion that goes beyond tired, a state of being where the world starts to fray at the edges. George was deep in that territory. He was pushing through the vast, empty quarter of West Texas, a place where the horizon was a flat, unforgiving line, and the towns were just names on a map, spaced 100 miles apart. His fuel light had been on for the last 40 miles, a tiny, amber beacon of his own stupidity. His stomach was a hollow, aching pit. He'd miscalculated, pushed too hard, and now he was paying the price, crawling along a dark highway in a steel box running on fumes and regret. Just as a real, tangible panic began to set in, he saw it, a light. At first, it was just a faint, hazy glow, but it quickly resolved into a splash of brilliant neon against the oppressive darkness. The sign was a cheerful, looping script that read, "The Starlight Diner, always open." Below the words was a buzzing, blinking coffee cup. It was an oasis, a miracle in the middle of nowhere. George had driven this route a dozen times and had never seen a diner on this stretch. It must be new, he thought, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him weep. He pulled his rig off the highway and into a surprisingly well-paved, but completely empty parking lot. The diner itself was a classic, prefabricated building of chrome and glass, glowing with an intense, almost clinical brightness that hurt his eyes. It looked pristine, untouched by the dust and decay of the surrounding desert. As he stepped out of his cab, the first thing he noticed was the silence. There was no hum from the neon sign, no sound of kitchen fans, no distant highway noise. The air was unnaturally still and heavy. The bell above the door didn't jingle when he pushed it open. It made no sound at all. The interior was just as bright as the outside, the white linoleum floors polished to a mirror shine. A long red vinyl counter stretched the length of the room, and a jukebox stood silent in the corner. The place was spotless, but it was the kind of clean that felt sterile and unused, like a museum exhibit. A handful of other patrons were scattered throughout the booths, a man in a dated suit reading a newspaper, a young couple sitting across from each other, holding hands but not speaking, an elderly woman staring into a cup of coffee. They all looked up as he entered, their movements perfectly synchronized. They didn't smile or nod. They just looked at him with a placid, unnerving emptiness in their eyes before returning to their silent activities in perfect unison. "Take a seat anywhere, hun," a voice called out. It was the waitress, a woman who looked like she'd stepped right out of a 1950s postcard. She had a beehive of blonde hair, a crisp pink uniform, and a wide, red-lipped smile that was absolutely perfect. Too perfect. It never wavered, never touched her eyes, which were a flat, doll-like blue. George slid onto a stool at the counter, the vinyl cool against his skin. "Evening," he mumbled, feeling strangely self-conscious. "Just a coffee and you got any apple pie?" "Best in Texas," the waitress said, her voice a smooth, even monotone. She glided away, her movements unnervingly fluid, her feet making no sound on the polished floor. As he waited, George took in the scene. The man's newspaper had no headlines, just dense blocks of unreadable text. The young couple hadn't moved a muscle. Their hands were clasped on the table like a pair of wax sculptures. The old woman was still staring into her coffee, her expression utterly blank. A low, distorted tune began to emanate from the jukebox. A familiar melody played so slowly and at such a low pitch that it sounded like a funeral dirge. The air was thick with a feeling of profound wrongness. The waitress returned and placed the coffee and pie in front of him. The coffee was black and steaming, but it had no aroma. The slice of pie was a work of art, with a perfectly latticed crust and a dusting of cinnamon. It looked like a photograph of a piece of pie. "Thanks," he said, his voice sounding rough and out of place. The waitress just kept smiling her fixed, vacant smile and moved to the end of the counter, where she began polishing an already gleaming coffee pot. George took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, but it was also nothing. It had no flavor, no bitterness, no warmth as it went down. It was like drinking hot water. He frowned and took a bite of the pie. The fork slid through it with no resistance. The texture in his mouth was soft, yielding, but there was no taste of apple, no spice, no sweetness. It was the culinary equivalent of static. He was chewing, he was swallowing, but he was consuming nothing. A cold dread began to creep up his spine. He looked at the other patrons. The man in the suit turned a page of his blank newspaper. The couple remained frozen. The old woman finally lifted her cup to her lips, but her movements were stiff and jerky, like a marionette. No one was actually eating or drinking. They were just going through the motions. His gaze fell upon the large, round clock on the wall. The second hand wasn't sweeping. It was stuck between the 7 and the 8, twitching almost imperceptibly. Time was broken here. He had to get out. He fumbled in his pocket for his wallet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do I owe you?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The waitress glided back over, her smile never faltering. "There's no charge," she said in her flat, melodic voice. "It's on the house." She leaned in a little closer, her doll-like eyes boring into him. "You were so hungry. You'll be back. They all come back." Her words hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a diner, it was a trap. A roach motel for the souls of weary travelers. He pushed himself away from the counter, his stool scraping loudly against the floor. It was the first real jarring sound he'd heard since he arrived. The patrons turned their heads to look at him again, their expressions unchanged, their dead eyes following his every move. He didn't say another word. He turned and fled, shoving the silent door open and stumbling out into the night. He didn't look back. He scrambled into the cab of his truck, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, deafening, real sound. He slammed the truck into gear and peeled out of the parking lot, spraying gravel, not caring if he tore his tires to shreds. He drove for a mile, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The diner's impossibly bright lights remained visible, a stark, unholy glow in the darkness. Then he crested a small hill. When he looked in his mirror again, the light was gone. He drove on for another 5 minutes before his curiosity and a lingering sense of disbelief got the better of him. He found a place to turn the big rig around and headed back. He had to know. He had to prove to himself that it had been real. He slowed as he approached the spot where the diner should have been. There was nothing. No building, no parking lot, no buzzing neon sign. There was only flat, empty desert, dotted with scrub brush and bathed in the faint light of the moon. It was as if the Starlight Diner had never existed. He pulled over and got out, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. He found the turnoff he had taken. It was an old, overgrown dirt track that ended abruptly after 50 feet in a thicket of mesquite. There were no signs of a building, no foundations, just dust and weeds that had clearly been undisturbed for decades. He stood there, stunned into silence. Had he dreamed it all? A hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion? He climbed back into his cab, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and fear. As he settled into his seat, his hand brushed against something on the passenger side. He looked down. Lying on the seat was a small cardboard matchbook. It was faded and worn, as if it were 50 years old. On the cover, in a looping, cheerful script, were the words, "The Starlight Diner." George stared at it, his blood turning to ice. It had been real. He looked at his fuel gauge. The needle was pointing to full. He touched his stomach. The hollow, aching feeling was gone. He felt sated, full. But he also felt a profound and terrifying emptiness, a cold spot deep inside him, as if the phantom food had nourished his body, but had taken something essential from his soul in return. He had been a customer at the diner that wasn't there, and he had a horrifying feeling that, just as the waitress had promised, a part of him would always be sitting in that silent, sterile, timeless place. Let's move to our 8th story. The air in the Louisiana bayou is different. It's not just air. It's a thick, wet, living thing that clings to your skin and fills your lungs with the smell of damp earth, sweet decay, and things best left undisturbed. Donnie was hauling a load of PVC pipes down a 2-lane state highway that cut through the Atchafalaya Basin, a road that felt less like a modern convenience and more like a temporary truce with the swamp. On either side, ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss stood like silent, skeletal sentinels, their roots lost in the inky black water. It was a place that felt ancient and predatory, a place where the 21st century seemed to hold no sway. It was just after 2 a.m. the hour when the world belongs to ghosts and hunters. Donnie was tired, his eyes gritty from staring into the hypnotic tunnel of his headlights. He was thinking about the greasy but satisfying po' boy he was going to get in Lafayette when a large shape bolted from the dense foliage on his right. There was no time to react. He felt a sickening, heavy thud that vibrated through the entire rig, followed by the high-pitched squeal of his brakes as he instinctively stomped on the pedal. The truck shuddered to a halt, the sudden silence of the cab amplifying the frantic pounding of his own heart. "Damn it," he breathed. The curse a small, inadequate sound in the vast, quiet swamp. He knew the protocol. You don't stop. You call it in, you check your truck for damage when you get to a safe, well-lit area. But you never, ever stop on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. But Donnie wasn't built that way. His father had taught him to respect the animals you share the world with, and the thought of leaving something to suffer on the asphalt gnawed at him. With a heavy sigh, he flicked on his hazard lights, their rhythmic amber flashes painting the surrounding trees in an eerie, pulsing glow. He grabbed his maglite from the passenger seat, a heavy, 4-cell beast that was as much a club as it was a flashlight, and climbed down from the cab. The humid air enveloped him instantly. The chorus of the swamp was a deafening symphony of chirping insects and the deep, guttural croak of bullfrogs. He walked toward the front of his truck, the powerful beam of his flashlight cutting a clean, white circle through the darkness. He expected to find a deer, maybe a wild hog. What he found was a mangled heap of fur and flesh lying in a dark, spreading pool on the road. It was a deer, a large buck with a magnificent rack of antlers. Or it had been. One of its front legs was bent back at an impossible, sickening angle, the white of the bone a stark slash against the dark fur. Its neck was clearly broken, twisted in a way that made Donnie's own neck ache in sympathy. A wave of pity and revulsion washed over him. It was a clean kill, at least. Quick! There was no sign of breathing, no twitching. It was just a tragic, inert piece of roadkill. He was about to turn away, to go check his bumper for damage, when the beam of his flashlight caught the deer's eye. It was open, and it was looking right at him. Donnie froze. It wasn't the blank, glassy stare of a dead animal. The eye was clear, dark, and focused. It held a terrifying, unmistakable glint of intelligence, of awareness. He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. It had to be a trick of the light, a post-mortem reflex. Animals sometimes twitched after death, but they didn't watch. He took a hesitant step closer, lowering the beam of the flashlight from the eye to the body. He needed to see it breathe, to see some sign of life that would make this less wrong. But the chest was still. The animal was a broken, ruined thing. Yet the eye remained fixed on him, unblinking, following his every move. Then, a sound. It was a low, wet, clicking noise, like a tree branch slowly being bent to its breaking point. Donnie's light snapped back to the deer's head. The buck's neck, the one that was so obviously and horrifically broken, began to move. It straightened itself out, not with the fluid motion of muscle, but with a series of grotesque, disjointed snaps. Crack, click, pop. Bone grated against bone. The head, which had been lolling on the asphalt, slowly lifted, turning to face him head-on. Both of its dark, intelligent eyes were now locked on his. Donnie's breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. This wasn't happening. He was seeing things, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the swamp. He took a step back, his boots scuffing on the pavement. The creature on the ground responded. With another series of sickening cracks, the broken foreleg began to pull itself in. It wasn't healing, It was rearranging. The shattered bone seemed to knit itself back together in a way that defied all laws of biology. The leg straightened, the hoof scraping against the asphalt as it found its footing. Then the other legs began to move, pushing the mangled torso upward. It stood, but it wasn't a deer anymore. The proportions were all wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too long and slender. Its joints seemed to bend in the wrong direction, giving it a spidery, unsettling posture. The fur on its body was patchy and matted with blood, and its skin seemed to hang loosely from a frame that was little more than bone. The magnificent antlers were no longer symmetrical. They were twisted and gnarled, looking more like the dead branches of a lightning-scorched tree. It let out a sound, a low, guttural rattle that seemed to come from deep within its ruined chest. It was a sound of immense pain, but also of immense, ancient hunger. The paralysis of fear that had held Donnie rooted to the spot finally broke. He didn't scream. He didn't have the air. He just turned and ran, a raw, animal terror propelling him forward. He scrambled for the door of his cab, his hands fumbling with the handle. He threw himself inside, slamming and locking the door behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear to see it again. He cranked the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a sound that was a prayer answered. He slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The tires squealed in protest as the rig lurched forward, gaining speed with agonizing slowness. He risked a glance in his side mirror. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, bathed in the red glow of his taillights. It wasn't chasing him. It was just standing there, its head cocked to one side, watching him go. The sight of its still, silent pursuit was somehow more terrifying than a frantic chase would have been. Donnie drove for the rest of the night in a state of cold, trembling shock. He didn't stop until he reached the outskirts of Houston, pulling into a massive, brightly lit truck stop that felt like a different planet from the dark, primal world of the swamp. He left the truck running, the doors locked, and sat there until the sun came up, chasing the worst of the shadows away. He tried to tell himself it had been a hallucination. He'd been tired, stressed, and the swamp had gotten into his head. He finally got up the nerve to get out and inspect the front of his truck. He needed to see the dent, the blood, the physical proof of the collision that would ground his memory in reality. There was nothing. The bumper was clean. There wasn't a scratch on it, not a single drop of blood, not a speck of deer fur. It was as if the impact had never happened. For a moment, relief washed over him. It had been a dream, a horrifyingly vivid, but ultimately unreal nightmare. He was about to laugh, a hysterical, ragged sound of a man pulled back from the brink, when his eyes fell on the roof of his cab, just above the windshield. There were 3 long, deep gouges scraped into the thick steel, running from the front to the back. They were fresh, the metal underneath gleaming in the morning sun. They looked as if something with enormous, powerful claws had dragged itself across the top of his truck while he was driving. He never drove through the Atchafalaya Basin at night again. But sometimes, when he's on a lonely stretch of road, he'll see a deer standing on the shoulder, its eyes reflecting in his headlights. And for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he'll see its head start to turn, its neck beginning to bend at an angle that is horribly, terribly wrong. Let's move to our 9th story. Roy was a man who believed in rules. He followed the hours of service regulations to the minute, kept his logbook immaculate, and maintained his rig with a mechanic's precision. In his 25 years of driving, he'd never received so much as a speeding ticket. He was a professional, a ghost on the highway, who did his job quietly and correctly. The rules were a shield, a way to make the chaotic, unpredictable world of the open road make sense. But on a long, moonless night on a forgotten stretch of U.S. Route 89A in northern Arizona, Roy was about to learn that some things operate by a set of rules he could never comprehend. The road was a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a vast geological cathedral. On either side, monstrous red rock formations rose up, their silhouettes like sleeping giants against a star-dusted sky. It was a profoundly empty place, a landscape that made a man feel small and temporary. Roy was hauling a load of medical supplies, and the silence in his cab was broken only by the low rumble of his engine and the soft hiss of the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the residual desert heat. He saw the lights in his rearview mirror first. They weren't the frantic, flashing strobes of a modern police cruiser. They were just two steady, piercingly bright red lights, mounted on the roof of a car that seemed to rise up out of the road itself. There was no siren, just the sudden, jarring appearance of the lights. Roy's heart gave a little jolt of surprise and annoyance. He glanced at his speedometer. He was doing 55, exactly the speed limit. His taillights were working. He'd checked them at his last stop. What could it be? Following procedure, he signaled, slowed, and pulled his rig onto the wide, dusty shoulder, the truck settling with a weary sigh. He cut the engine, and the immense primordial silence of the desert rushed in. He watched in his mirror as the patrol car, an older model, maybe a Crown Victoria from the 90s, pulled in behind him. It was painted in the classic black and white of the highway patrol, but it was too clean, too perfect. There wasn't a speck of desert dust on its gleaming finish. The driver's side door opened, and a figure emerged. He was tall and lean, his movements economical and precise. He wore the crisp, tan uniform of the Arizona Highway Patrol, complete with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He walked toward the cab with a steady, unhurried pace, his boots making no sound on the gravel shoulder. Roy had his license, registration, and logbook ready on the passenger seat. He rolled down his window, the warm, sage-scented night air flooding the cab. "Evening, officer. Was there a problem?" The patrolman stopped beside the driver's side door, his body angled just so he wasn't directly in the light from the cab. "Good evening," the officer said. His voice was calm, deep, and unnervingly neutral. It was a voice devoid of any accent or inflection, like a recording. "License and registration, please." Roy handed the documents out the window. The officer took them, his fingers brushing against Roy's. The patrolman's skin was shockingly cold, like marble, a stark contrast to the balmy night. Roy pulled his hand back, a strange, unpleasant shiver running up his arm. The officer examined the documents with a small, pen-sized flashlight. "Roy Miller," he said, reading the name from the license. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "You're a long way from home." "Just doing my job, sir," Roy replied, his professional demeanor a thin shield against a growing sense of unease. The patrolman didn't respond. He just stood there, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Roy shifted in his seat, trying to get a better look at the man's face beneath the hat's brim. "Officer," Roy started, "if you don't mind me asking, what was the reason for the stop?" The patrolman finally looked up from the documents, and Roy felt the air leave his lungs. The man's face was pale and angular, a collection of sharp, severe lines. But it was his eyes that stole Roy's breath. They were completely, utterly black. There was no white, no iris, no pupil. Just two flat, polished orbs of pure blackness, like obsidian or lumps of coal. They didn't reflect the light from the cab. They seemed to drink it, to pull it into an infinite, empty depth. "Your left rear trailer tire," the officer said, his voice never changing its dead, monotone pitch. "It crossed the center line for a moment, about 2 miles back." Roy frowned. "I don't think so, officer. I'm very careful about that." He knew he hadn't crossed the line. He was certain of it. The patrolman's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but it held no warmth, no humor. It was just a mechanical parting of his thin, pale lips. "The rules of the road are very precise, Mr. Miller. They exist for a reason. One small deviation can lead to consequences." The way he said consequences sent another chill through Roy. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was something else. "You've been driving for a long time," the officer continued, his black eyes fixed on Roy. He wasn't looking at the documents anymore. 25 years. You've seen a lot of miles, a lot of lonely nights." "That's right," Roy said, his voice a little shaky. How did he know that? It wasn't on his license. "You think about your wife, Susan, on those lonely nights," the patrolman stated. "You think about the argument you had before you left, the things you said, the things you wish you could take back." Roy felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The argument had been a bad one, a stupid fight about bills that had left a sour taste in both their mouths. He'd been replaying it in his head for the last 500 miles. There was no way this man could know that. "Who are you?" Roy whispered, the question he should have asked from the beginning. "I'm just a patrolman," the man replied, his cold smile widening slightly. "I watch the roads. I see who follows the lines and who crosses them, not just the ones painted on the asphalt." He leaned in a little closer, and Roy could feel a palpable cold radiating from him. "I see the line you crossed in Flagstaff in 1998, the motel, the waitress. Susan never knew about that one, did she? But the line was crossed. A rule was broken." Roy's mind reeled. A one-night stand, a stupid, drunken mistake from over 2 decades ago that he had buried under a mountain of guilt and shame. It was a secret he thought he'd take to his grave. This isn't real," Roy stammered, his rational mind trying to fight back against the impossible truth of the situation. "You're not a cop. My uniform is just a formality," the officer said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A shape that you can understand. You humans have so many rules, so many little lines you draw for yourselves. But you cross them all eventually, one by one." He handed the license and registration back to Roy. "I'm not going to write you a ticket tonight, Mr. Miller." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Roy's chest. A ticket. He was worried about a ticket. "I'm just going to give you a warning," the patrolman continued, his black, empty eyes seeming to look right through Roy, into the darkest corners of his soul. "The road ahead is very dark, and it gets much narrower. There's a turn coming, a sharp one. You won't see it until it's too late. Be ready." Without another word, the patrolman turned and walked back to his car with the same silent, deliberate steps. He got in, and the black and white cruiser pulled back onto the highway, its 2 red lights shrinking in the distance before vanishing completely, as if they had simply been switched off. There was no sound of its engine, not coming or going. Roy sat in his cab, trembling, his body drenched in a cold sweat. He was hyperventilating, his mind a chaotic jumble of fear and disbelief. He looked at his license in his hand. It felt cold, as if it had been chilled in a freezer. He didn't know how long he sat there, but eventually, The survival instinct that had kept him safe on the road for a quarter of a century kicked in. He started his truck and pulled back onto the highway, driving with a frantic, desperate urgency. He had to get to a town, to lights, to people. He drove for 2 hours, his eyes constantly darting to his rearview mirror, expecting to see those 2 red lights reappear. When he finally reached the outskirts of a small town, he pulled into the first motel he saw. He called the Arizona Highway Patrol Dispatch. His voice was shaking as he explained the situation, the traffic stop, the strange officer. The woman on the other end of the line was patient, but her reply was chilling. "Sir," she said, "I can assure you we haven't had a unit on that stretch of 89A all night. The closest patrol car is over 100 miles away. And we haven't used that model of Crown Victoria in almost 15 years. Roy hung up the phone, the last of his rational explanations crumbling to dust. He knew what he had seen. He had been pulled over, judged, and warned by something that was not human. Something that patrolled the loneliest roads and enforced a set of rules far older and more terrible than any traffic laws. He never forgot the warning. Every curve in the road, every dark stretch of highway, filled him with a gnawing dread. He was a man who had always found comfort in the rules, but he now knew that he was on a road where the lines had been erased, and he was driving toward a final, sharp turn in the dark that he would never see coming. Let's move to our 10th story. To Mike, his truck was more than a machine. It was an extension of his own body. He knew every groan of the engine, every vibration in the chassis, every blind spot in his mirrors. After 12 years on the road, a pre-trip inspection was as natural to him as breathing. It was a ritual, a quiet conversation between man and machine before they embarked on another lonely journey. On a damp, gray morning at a truck stop south of Portland, Oregon, the ritual was broken. As he was checking the seal on his driver's side fuel tank, he noticed something sitting on the cap. It was a small glass marble, the kind kids play with, a perfect sphere of deep blue swirled with white. It was caked in fresh, wet mud. Mike frowned, picking it up. He rolled the cold, smooth object in his palm. A kid must have dropped it. He tossed it into the weeds, tightened the fuel cap, and thought nothing more of it. His route was a long, straight shot down Interstate 5, hauling a load of lumber to a depot just outside Bakersfield, California. The first few hours were uneventful. The relentless Oregon rain beat a familiar, lulling rhythm on his roof. The world was a smear of green and gray. He was in the zone, a state of relaxed focus where the miles just seemed to melt away. It was near the California border, as the landscape began to open up and the rain finally subsided, that the second strange thing happened. He was scanning the CB channels, mostly out of habit, when a sound cut through the static. It wasn't a voice. It was music. A tinny, delicate melody, like a child's music box playing a simple, hauntingly familiar tune he couldn't quite place. It was slightly off-key, the notes sour and discordant. It played for no more than 10 seconds and then vanished, replaced by the empty hiss of the airwaves. Mike fiddled with the dial, but the channel was dead. He shook his head. Weird radio skip. The atmospheric conditions over the mountains could do strange things to a signal. Still, the sad, broken little melody lingered in his mind, an earworm that left a trail of unease. Later that afternoon, he pulled into a large travel center for fuel. The place was bustling, a chaotic ballet of trucks and RVs and cars full of weary families. The noise and activity were a welcome change from the solitude of the cab. He filled his tanks, grabbed a stale hot dog and a coffee, and was back on the road in 20 minutes. As he merged back onto the interstate, he did a routine check of his gauges. His eyes fell on the fuel gauge for the passenger side tank. It was reading half full. That was impossible. He had just filled it to the brim himself, had watched the numbers on the pump spin. He was meticulous about fuel. He had to be. He pulled over onto the shoulder, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He got out and walked around to the passenger side. The fuel cap was gone, not unscrewed and sitting on the side. It was completely gone. And there, on the asphalt, directly below the tank, was a large, dark, shimmering puddle of diesel fuel. Someone had siphoned half his tank, in broad daylight, in a crowded, busy truck stop right under his nose. A cold, angry fear washed over him. It wasn't just the cost of the fuel. It was the violation, the audacity. Someone had been watching him, had waited for the precise moment he was inside paying, and had helped themselves. He scanned the river of traffic flowing past him, wondering if one of those cars, one of those trucks, held the thief. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He found his spare cap, secured the tank, and got back on the road. But the easy rhythm of the drive was shattered. Every car that lingered in his blind spot, every truck that passed him, was now a potential threat. The sun was setting as he pulled into a designated rest area in the Sacramento Valley. He was behind schedule now, and his nerves were frayed. He needed to get a few hours of sleep. The rest area was small and eerily quiet, tucked away in a grove of eucalyptus trees. There was only one other vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. Mike chose a spot as close to the entrance and the dim overhead lights as possible. He locked his doors, pulled the curtains around his sleeper berth, and tried to force his racing mind to shut down. Sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of the wind in the trees, every distant sound from the highway made him jump. He felt a profound and irrational sense of being watched. At one point, he was sure he heard a faint, rhythmic scratching sound from outside near the back of his trailer. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He told himself it was a branch rubbing against the metal in the breeze. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the image of the stolen fuel, the strange music, the muddy marble from his mind. It was just a string of bad luck, of strange coincidences. That's all it was. He must have drifted off eventually, because he woke with a start to the gray light of dawn filtering through a gap in his curtains. He felt groggy and unrested, a sour, anxious taste in his mouth. He got out of the truck to stretch his stiff limbs. The pickup truck was gone. He was alone. The morning air was cool and smelled of eucalyptus. He did a slow walk around of his rig, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. Everything seemed fine. The fuel caps were secure. The tires were good. He was about to climb back into the cab when the low golden angle of the morning sun caught the side of his trailer. It was a standard, unpainted aluminum trailer, its surface dulled by thousands of miles of road grime. But the light revealed something new, a series of lines that weren't supposed to be there. He stepped closer, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. They were words. Someone had taken something sharp, a rock or a key or a knife, and had crudely scratched a message into the dirty metal side of his trailer. The letters were jagged and uneven, filled with a palpable, hateful energy. This was no random act of vandalism. The message was for him. It read, "Your daughter has your eyes. Don't go to Bakersfield." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Mike's lungs. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His daughter, his sweet, 7-year-old Emily. How? How could they know about her? He had a single wallet-sized photo of her tucked into his sun visor. Had they peered into his cab while he slept? The thought was a physical violation that made him feel sick to his stomach. The marble, the music box, the stolen fuel. They weren't random events. They were messages. They were a prelude. They were someone toying with him. A cat playing with a mouse before the final, killing bite. This wasn't a simple thief or a vandal. This was something deeply personal, deeply malevolent. His hands shaking uncontrollably, he pulled out his phone and called his wife. His voice was a choked, panicked whisper as he asked if everything was okay, if Emily was safe. His wife, still half asleep, reassured him that everything was fine. Emily was in her bed, sleeping soundly. But the reassurance did nothing to quell the terror that had taken root in his soul. The threat wasn't in the past, it was in the future. Don't go to Bakersfield. He called the police. A state trooper arrived 20 minutes later, his expression a mixture of boredom and mild concern. He took a report, examined the scratches, and asked the standard questions. Did Mike have any enemies? Had he been in any altercations on the road? The trooper was professional, but Mike could see it in his eyes. To him, this was just a weird prank, a particularly nasty bit of graffiti. There was nothing they could do. But Mike knew this was no prank. He was a target. Someone, for some unknowable reason, had been following him for hundreds of miles, watching his every move, learning the intimate details of his life. And they were waiting for him. He sat in his cab for over an hour, paralyzed by fear and indecision. His entire life was built on schedules and destinations. He had a load of lumber that had to be in Bakersfield by noon. But the words scratched on his trailer were a stark, terrifying ultimatum. He looked at the photo of his daughter, at her bright, smiling eyes, so much like his own. He started the engine. He pulled out of the rest area and back onto the interstate. But when he reached the junction for Highway 99, the main artery to Bakersfield, he didn't take it. He stayed on Interstate 5, heading south, away from his destination. He called his dispatcher, his voice a strained, hollow version of his own, and told him he was quitting. Effective immediately. He was leaving the truck and the load at the next major depot. He didn't know if the threat in Bakersfield was real. He would never know. But he knew that the person who had scratched that message into his trailer was real. They were out there, somewhere in the sea of cars and trucks, and they had proven that they could get to him whenever they wanted. He had spent his life on the road, but for the first time, the endless ribbon of asphalt didn't represent freedom. It represented a hunting ground. And he was the prey. Let's move to our 11th and final story. Earl was what the old-timers called a lifer. He'd been married to the road for 43 years, and his freight liner was more a home to him than the small, empty house he returned to twice a year. He knew his truck's soul. He could diagnose a misfiring injector by the tremor it sent through the floorboards and tell the difference between a flat inner dual and a flat outer dual by the subtle shift in the steering wheel. His truck was a part of him, an obedient, powerful beast of steel and diesel that did exactly what he commanded. The concept of it acting on its own was as alien to him as the idea of his own hand suddenly deciding to strangle him. He'd pulled into a quiet, tree-lined rest stop in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, the air cool and smelling of pine. He was ahead of schedule, a rare luxury, and decided to get a solid 4 hours of sleep before tackling the winding mountain roads at dawn. He drew the thick curtain separating the cab from the sleeper berth, the familiar action of final, comforting ritual before sleep. He was out before his head even fully settled on the pillow. He awoke not to the buzz of his alarm, but to a gentle rocking motion. For a groggy, disoriented moment, he thought he was dreaming. But the feeling was too real. It was the familiar, deep-seated rumble of the Cummins engine, the rhythmic sway of the chassis navigating a curve, the faint hiss of the air brakes. His eyes snapped open in the darkness of the berth. The truck was moving. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him, vaporizing the last remnants of sleep. His first thought was a hijacking. Someone had broken in, hot-wired the truck, and was stealing it with him still inside. He'd heard stories, but they were rare, almost mythical. He fumbled in the dark, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and ripped the curtain back. The cab was empty. Earl stared, his mind refusing to process the impossible sight before him. The driver's seat was vacant. Yet, the truck was not just moving. It was being driven. He watched, frozen in a state of horrified disbelief, as the massive steering wheel made a small, precise correction, turning a few degrees to the left to follow a gentle curve in the road. The glow from the dashboard illuminated the pedals, and he could see the accelerator pedal slightly depressed, holding a steady speed. This wasn't a runaway truck rolling downhill. This was a controlled, deliberate act. He scrambled over the console and fell into the driver's seat, his hands instinctively grabbing for the wheel. It felt like trying to turn a column of solid steel. It wouldn't budge. It fought his grip with a silent, immense force, continuing its steady, ghostly guidance. He stomped on the brake pedal with all his might. Nothing happened. The pedal was stiff, unyielding, as if it were welded to the floor. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at his throat. He reached for the ignition, his fingers closing around the key. He twisted it, trying to kill the engine. The key wouldn't turn. It was locked in the on position. He tried the gear shifter, hoping to throw the truck into neutral. It was fused in place. "What the hell is going on?" he screamed, his voice a ragged, terrified sound that was swallowed by the steady drone of the engine. He was a prisoner in his own cab, a helpless passenger in a machine he had commanded for over 1,000,000 miles. He looked out the windshield. They weren't on the interstate anymore. The truck was navigating a narrow, 2-lane country road he didn't recognize, flanked by a dense, impenetrable wall of trees. The moon was hidden behind a thick cloud cover, and the only light was the twin beams of his headlights, cutting a lonely path into the oppressive darkness. He grabbed his phone. No service, of course. The GPS screen on his dash was dark, lifeless. He was being taken somewhere, pulled along by an unseen, unknowable driver. The truck sped up, its engine roaring as it climbed a steep grade, then slowed with impossible smoothness as it descended the other side. It was being driven with a skill that bordered on supernatural, its movements fluid and confident in the pitch-black night. He began to feel a presence in the cab with him. It wasn't something he could see, but a palpable, malevolent intelligence that filled the small space. The air grew cold, a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The radio crackled to life, the dial spinning wildly through the frequencies, a chaotic storm of static, snippets of old-timey music, and distorted, whispering voices. "Who's doing this?" Earl yelled at the empty air. "What do you want?" The radio stopped its frantic search, settling on a dead channel. From the speaker, a single clear sound emerged, the faint, tinny melody of a child's music box. It was a simple, sad tune that made the hairs on Earl's arms stand on end. It played for a moment, then faded back into static. The truck made a sharp right turn, leaving the paved road behind. It was now on a rough, unpaved logging trail, branches scraping and screeching along the sides of his trailer like claws. The ride was jarring, throwing him from side to side, but the truck never faltered, its phantom driver navigating the ruts and rocks with an eerie precision. He was being taken deep into the woods, far from any road, far from any hope of being found. He realized, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he wasn't being hijacked for his cargo or his truck. He was the cargo. He was being delivered. After what felt like an eternity, the truck slowed. It pulled into a small circular clearing, the kind of place where loggers would turn their equipment around. The trees formed a tight, suffocating circle around the clearing, their branches blocking out what little starlight there was. The truck rolled to a perfect stop in the exact center of the space. The engine cut out. The sudden, absolute silence was more terrifying than the roar of the engine had been. The headlights flicked off, plunging the world into a blackness so complete that Earl couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. He sat there, his breath held tight in his chest, every nerve screaming. Thud. A loud metallic sound echoed through the cab. The driver's side door had just locked itself. Thud. The passenger side. He was sealed in. He threw his shoulder against the door, but it was like hitting a wall of solid rock. He was entombed in his own truck, in the middle of a dark forest, miles from civilization. He sat in the driver's seat, trembling, his eyes straining against the impenetrable darkness, listening. He was no longer a trucker. He was bait. He was a sacrifice, delivered to this dark, unholy altar. The carefully constructed world of rules and mechanics he had lived in for 43 years had been peeled back to reveal an abyss of impossible, malevolent horror. He didn't know how long he waited. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had ceased to have meaning. All he knew was the cold, the silence, and the suffocating darkness. And then he heard it. A sound from outside, the soft, deliberate crunch of a single footstep on the dry leaves. And then another. Something was approaching the driver's side door, and it was taking its time.